Alright. So at this point, the user is able to log into our app, but what we're going to need to do next is allow ourselves to access data about the user such as the user's ID. So what we're going to do here is open up the app component. Alright? So the app component is what we're looking for here. There we go. And what we're going to have the app component do is actually subscribe to changes in the user's logged in state. Now, if that sounds complicated, don't worry too much because Firebase Auth provides us with a function that does exactly that. So what we're going to do is import two things from Firebase Author. The first thing is going to be getAuth, right? We've seen that function already. And the second thing is going to be a function called onAuthStateChanged, okay? And we're going to import both of those from Firebase/Auth. So what we're going to do now is inside our app components created method which we actually have to add first. So we'll say created. We're going to use this onAuthStateChanged function to subscribe to changes in the user's authenticated state. So in other words, we're going to have a callback function that will get called whenever the user logs in or logs out. Okay? So what this is going to look like is we're going to say, first of all const getAuth or const auth rather equals getAuth. And then we're going to call onAuthStateChanged with that auth object as the first argument. And as the second argument we're going to have a callback function that will take a user as an argument, right? So this user is going to be either null if the user is currently logged out, or it's going to be the user data from Firebase if the user is currently logged in. And we can use this information in our other components to change the way our interface is displayed. So what we're going to do here actually is we're going to have some data to our app. And the main thing that we're going to have here is a property called user, right? So it's going to start auth as null because the user will start auth as logged out, but then whenever the onAuthStateChanged callback is triggered, we're going to set this user data to whatever Firebase just gave us, right? So either null again, if the user's logged out, or user data if the user is logged in. So what that's going to look like is we're going to say this.user equals user. And now what we can do is we can pass this user data down to all of our pages as a prop. Now, since we're using router view here, what this is going to look like is we're just going to pass the prop to router view. So we'll say user equals user. And now what we should be able to do is inside our product detail page, for example, we can just add a prop called user. So we'll say props and then an array with the string user inside of it. And we can now access the value of the user and use that to hide and show some of these buttons up at the top. So what that's going to look like is we're going to say v if not item is in cart. And right, so we'll say user to check if the user exists and add that as another condition for v if, right? So we only want to show add to cart or item is already in cart if the user is logged in, right? Otherwise we want to show this sign in to add to cart button. Same thing for our item is already in cart button. We're going to say user and item is in cart. And for our sign in to add to cart we're going to say v if equals not user, right? So we only want to show that if the user doesn't exist. Cool. So now that we have our app component that's taking care of managing the user, the next thing that we're going to need to do is listen for changes to this user prop. And if a user, let's say, logs in on our sign-in page, we're going to want to load the user's cart data then, because currently what we're doing is just loading the user's cart down here in our created method. And that's not necessarily what we want to do. So first of all, what we're going to do is wrap this up inside an if statement that checks to see if the user is already logged in and only loads the user's cart if they are. So we're also going to want to change this ID from the placeholder 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to the actual ID of the user, which we can now access by saying this.user.uid, right? So that's just Firebase's property that it uses to store the randomly generated user ID. And we're also going to want to do the same thing, as I set up in a watch method. So what we're going to do here is we'll do it underneath computed. We're going to add a watch for when the user changes, right? When that user prop changes. And what that's going to look like is we're going to say async user, and then this will give us the new user value as an argument. That's just how watch works in Vue. And then inside here we're just going to paste what we copied from down below. So now what we can do is if the new user value exists, right? In other words, if the user just logged in, then we're going to use that user's user ID to load their cart. So this just makes sure that the user's cart gets logged in no matter what. Alright? So if we add new user value.uid there and save it, what we should be able to do now is go back to our front end and let's just close that. We're going to hit refresh now. And sure enough we'll only see add to cart. Now, in order to test this we're actually going to have to log the user out, and that's the next thing that we're going to see how to do. Alright, so now that we've allowed our user to log in and we've subscribed to authentication state changes, the next thing that we're going to have to do in order to make testing easier from now on is make it possible for our users to log out. So what we're going to do here is add a simple sign out button to the top of our nav bar, and what that's going to involve is just opening up our nav bar component. And then what we're going to do is we're going to start off by importing the getAuth function from Firebase Auth, as well as the signout function. So we'll import those from Firebase/Auth, and then down here in our nav bar, what we're going to want to do is create a method for signing out. So we'll say methods, then we'll create a signout method, like so. And inside here all we're going to have to do is say const auth equals getAuth, and then we'll say signout auth. So that's going to call Firebase's signout method there and log the user out. And all that does is it deletes some data that's stored on the user's browser behind the scenes. So anyway, now that we've done that, let's just add a button to our nav bar that will allow the user to sign out. What this is going to look like is we're going to start off by wrapping our shopping cart button in a div with the class name of navButtonsWrap. That's just for styling purposes there. And once we've done that, we're going to put our router link and shopping cart button inside of that. And we're going to add a button next to the router link, so above it in our case, and that button is going to say, sign out. And for that button's attributes, we're going to say, @click equals sign out. And we also need to remove this class from our router link. So let's save that and go back to our front end and hit refresh, and, sure enough, we should see that our two buttons are next to each other in the nav bar. But it looks like something happened while loading our data. Now, what happened here? You can actually see this in the server that's running. We got some kind of error when we tried to access user.cart items. Now, the reason this happened is because in our case here, the user doesn't yet have a shopping cart. The user has a new ID that was generated for us by Firebase, so what we need to do is just open up server.js and anywhere where we say user.cartItems. We just need to add a default value for that and back it up with this question mark thing in case the user doesn't exist there. So you can just do a global find and replace like I'm doing here, and I'm just going to replace all three of those things like so. And now we should be able to restart our server and see that that error won't happen anymore. So let's go back to the front end and hit refresh. And, sure enough, we'll see that everything is back to normal. So let's try signing out now and see if that changes the button like we want it to. We're going to say sign out and, sure enough, that changes this button to say sign in to add to cart. And if you want to test that out by clicking that and re-entering your email, so I'm going to enter my shaun.vue.test fake email into there and click OK. And again, we'll see this alert that says a login link was sent to the email you provided. And if we go back to our email now, we should see that we have another link, which we can click. Well, you can click. Since I'm testing this in incognito mode, just for account reasons, I'm going to just copy the link address here and go back and paste that here and hit enter. And what we should see is that it says, successfully signed in, and once we click OK, that will load the data for us and we'll see that it says add to cart. Now, one last thing that I want to do with our nav bar here is make it so that the sign out button up here is hidden when the user is logged out. There's no reason to show that if the user isn't already logged in the first place. So this is actually pretty straightforward. What we're going to do is add another prop to our nav bar, and actually this will be the first prop that we add to our nav bar. So we're going to say props and then we'll allow the app component to pass down the same user prop to our nav bar as it passed down to our product detail page. So let's open up AppView now, and what we're going to do is have it pass down user equals user to our nav bar, and now we can use that prop to show and hide the sign out button. So all we need to do is say vif equals, and we're going to say user. So we only want to show this if the user exists because they're signed in. And now what we should be able to do is go back to our front end and we'll hit refresh here. There we go. And now if we click sign out, what we should see is that that sign out button disappears, as the user is signed out, as well as the text changing on this button down here. So anyway, that's how to sign a user out and hide the button accordingly. Alright. So the last thing that we're going to see how to do here is add items to the user's cart with our new authentication setup, as well as remove items from the user's cart. Now, the first thing that we're going to have to do here in order to make sure everything works properly is we're going to have to make one important change to our server, right? Because currently, we only have one user in our database, and that's the user with the ID 12345 that we put there earlier. So what we're going to need to do is when our server receives a request to add an item to the cart and we don't already have a user with that ID in the database, we're going to need to add a new user with that ID. So if you scroll down to the post endpoint for adding a new item to a user's cart, what we're going to want to do here is before we call db.collection users.update1, right? Which you'll notice if we don't already have a user with this ID, it just isn't going to do anything because there's no matching user to update. What we're going to want to do before that is check to see if there's an existing user, and if there isn't, we're going to create a new one. So here's what this is going to look like. We're going to start off by saying const existing user equals await, and then we'll say db.collection users, and we're going to want to find one user whose ID matches the user ID URL parameter. Alright, so now that we have this existing user loaded from the database, we're going to need to check and see if the user exists. Now, if existing user is undefined, as it will be if we didn't find any matching users, then what we're going to want to do, as I said, is insert a new user with an empty shopping cart. And then just let the rest of this logic run from before. So here's what that's going to look like. We're going to say, if there is no existing user, right? If the existing user doesn't actually exist, in other words, if it's undefined, we're going to say await db.collection users.insert1. And we're going to insert a new user whose ID matches that user ID URL parameter. And we're also going to add a cart items property, that's going to be an empty array. Alright, so that will create a new user that we can then add item IDs to their cart for. So now that we've added that to the server, we should be able to go back to our product detail page and let's open up the method for adding to cart, right? This add to cart method here. What we're going to need to do is instead of sending a request to 12,345, we're going to need to actually insert the user's ID there. So here's what that's going to look like. We're just going to change these single quotes to backticks, like so. And then instead of just having hard-coded 12345, we will use the user's ID by saying this.user.uid, okay? And that should be really the only change we need to make there. So now, let's head over to the shopping cart page, where we're going to have to add logic not only for loading a user's shopping cart, right? We're going to need to change that ID for this one as well. But we're also going to have to change this when we're removing an item from the user's cart. So let's start off here by adding similar logic to what we had in our product detail page to our shopping cart page. What we're going to do is find the watch that we added for the user prop and add that to our shopping cart page. We'll put that right underneath our data here, I suppose. And as a matter of fact, we're also going to want to add that user prop in the first place. So again, because our app is passing down this user prop to the router view, all of the pages that router view displays can access it automatically. So let's add a user prop to our shopping cart page. And now that we have this watch, that's automatically going to try and load the user's cart if the user logs in, let's say, right? And since we copy this from the product detail page, we already have all of the correct logic. The next thing that we can do now is change this remove from cart method so that it actually incorporates the user's correct ID. So let's just change this here. What we're going to do is instead of having 12,345, we're going to insert the user's ID by saying this.user.uid. And that should be all we need to do there. And last but not least, down here in the created method, we're going to want to load the user's cart items only if the user is logged in, alright? So, otherwise, we're just going to display that message saying that the user doesn't have any items in their cart, which if they're not logged in, is going to be absolutely true. So let's say if this.user, and then, of course, we're going to put all of this logic inside of there. So we'll just paste that here. So, now, it's only going to load the user's cart if the user is logged in. And, alright, and this also needs us to change the user's ID here. So let's just change these to backticks and say this.user.uid/cart. Alright. So that should be all we need to do to make our add to cart and remove from cart functionality work with our new authentication logic. So let's open up our front end. Well, first of all, let's make sure there's no errors. So let's take a look at the back end and the front end. And it looks like both the front end and back end are running correctly. So let's hit refresh here. And let's try now to sign in and add some items to our cart. So I'm going to sign in again with my test email. And there we go. I'll click OK. And now I should be able to head over to my email and find the new email that I received. So, once again, I'm going to copy this link, but you should be able to click it and open it up in the new tab. So I'm going to say copy link address and I'm going to come back here and replace this and log in, like so. Okay, so it should say, successfully signed in, once again. And now, we see that sign out button show up, so that shows us that we're logged in. So now, what we should be able to do is add items to our cart, and also view our cart and remove them. So let's try adding the basil olive oil to our cart. We're just going to click add to cart here. And sure enough, it says, successfully added item to cart. So let's do the same thing now for the garlic olive oil, I suppose. We'll try this again, click add to cart. That one was successfully added as well. So now, if we go over to our shopping cart, and nope, it looks like something went wrong. And actually, this is because I mistyped the name of the props here, right? That should be props instead of prop. So let's try this again. We're going to save it. And if we go back and hit refresh, we should see that it'll successfully load all of our products for us. And let's now try removing these items from our cart. We should be able to click on one of these. And sure enough, that removes the item. So, anyway, at this point, we've fully integrated our app with Firebase Authentication, so the next step for us is going to be releasing this app.